Philosophemes podcast, where we do philosophy the traditional way. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Scalambrino. So grateful you're here. The Philosophemes podcast is proudly part of the Evergreen Podcast Network. If you're looking for excellent podcasts, you'll find them on Evergreen. Thank you for supporting and sharing this educational podcast. Any political or religious ideas discussed in this episode are solely for the sake of philosophical education. Everyone is welcome here on the Philosophemes podcast.
This podcast episode originally aired on Dr. Frank Scalambrino's previous podcast, Basic Philosophical Questions.
Since I've already written all of this content in a book, it's titled Full Throttle Heart, The Rapture and Ecstasy of Nietzsche's Dionysian Worldview. This is the second edition title. The first edition title was Full Throttle Heart, Nietzsche Beyond Either Or. I thought that what I would do is read from the text itself to you. So that's what we're going to be doing. And I do have the organization here of the content and the overview of what we're going to be looking at in regard to the eternal return. This, by the way, forgive me for mentioning, but I just want you to know that this is the result of a tremendous amount of research. So I understand that there are other presentations in regard to the eternal return on YouTube and other characterizations of the eternal return on the internet that maybe don't include this information or lead you in a different direction. However, I stand by this characterization of the eternal return. All right, so the overview, then we have 2 comments about its origin, 1 comment about its name, what does it mean, then 4th and 5th, how does it relate to what I'm referring to here as the orders of existence? We'll talk about these, of course, in a moment, but this is a perennial division in the history of philosophy. So what I'm calling the orders of existence, you can find the logic of the orders of existence across the history of philosophy and in many philosophers. In fact, it actually comes out of Plato. Lastly, how does it relate to fate? These are the topics that we'll be addressing in order to articulate and discuss the eternal return in this episode. But I do want to just say a couple other things before we get started as a quick little disclaimer here. So what we find is many people immediately think, when they think of Nietzsche, they think that Nietzsche is an atheist. He's not. And they also think that Nietzsche, because there are phrases like the overturning of Platonism and those kinds of terms, the transvaluation of all values and things like this, that people tend to think that Nietzsche must be some kind of a radical contradiction to Plato or Christianity. And I think that is an oversimplification. So I've had some people encounter my work and say things to me like, how is this any different from all of philosophy? And that's sort of shocking to me. I like, well, I don't know what you mean by that. This is philosophy, right? So, it's not as though Nietzsche just like painted a picture and then dropped the microphone. Nietzsche is working inside of the history of Western philosophy. He knows the history of Western philosophy well, and he's working inside of a tradition. And I think that it's important to know that and to point that out, because some people will try to suggest that you cannot use Kant or transcendental philosophy to make sense of Nietzsche's writings. And if you believe that, then you will never understand Nietzsche. And the reason is let me just say 2 things that will help explain this very quickly. And the one is that if you just look at the way that Nietzsche talks about his own writings, especially, for example, when in looking back and describing The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche talks about how that book was too Hegelian, that book was too steeped in Hegel's philosophy or too interested in engaging Hegel's philosophy. The idea, of course, is that Hegel's philosophy is predicated upon Kant's philosophy. So regardless of my criticisms of Hegel that are too numerous to recount here, Kant is in the background of Hegel. When Nietzsche says that this book is too Hegelian, there isn't some sense then in which Nietzsche just starts to write in a vacuum, right? It's not the case that Nietzsche is then suddenly just going to just go do something completely different. And if you understand the history of philosophy and you understand what's going on with Kant and this movement into Kant and then the movement from Kant into German idealism and German romanticism and into Hegel, then for these thinkers, there's a sense in which it's the only game in town, right? There's this great Louis White Beck quote in regard to Kant. You can philosophize with Kant or you can philosophize against Kant, but you can't philosophize without Kant. And it's true. So we must take, no matter how we want to reject it or criticize it later, and I think reject is too strong of a term, but we must take transcendental philosophy as a point of departure for understanding Nietzsche. I, in no way, shape, or form, am the only person who have suggested this. Tons of books have been written about the relationship between Nietzsche and transcendental philosophy and Nietzsche and Kant specifically. There's even a book titled Nietzsche's Three Critiques. It relates Nietzsche's writings to Kant's three critiques. Just recently, I was contacted by somebody and they wanted to exchange with me a little bit about this book, Full Throttle Heart, and I was happy to do so, but they kind of became pretty aggressive with me, I thought. They were kind of getting a little hostile with me. They were angry that in some way, shape, or form, I was suggesting that Nietzsche was participating in the history of philosophy. Well, what else do you think he's doing if you don't? I mean, he's not writing in a vacuum. And once we have a grip on the eternal return, this will be very helpful also for understanding the next episode. This is one of our Philosophemes. So here's the quote. "And life itself told me this secret. Behold, it said, I am that which must overcome itself again and again." If you take this as a soteriological insight or a soteriological comment, then there is a sense here in which Nietzsche is suggesting something like, even when you have accomplished this highest attitude or highest relation to existence, this is something that must continue to be renewed because it's the case that existence itself is continually renewed. It's also the case, though, that we could take this as an ontological comment or as an aspect of cosmology, that Nietzsche is talking about becoming here. And so this is the idea that all that is constantly in a state of becoming, and it is constantly overcoming itself. And so therefore, the eternal is, as Aristotle was very clear with us about, that the eternal is eternal motion in a circle. We are constantly cycling and recycling, that life itself must overcome itself again and again. This constant state of becoming or coming to be. So here then, we're going to start to look at the eternal return. There's much to say about this idea and much to say about its origin. However, for now, we will only comment on the most relevant 5 introductory points. First, the first comment about its origin we have essentially already made. Nietzsche's invention or discovery of the idea of the eternal return concluded the first phase of his philosophical career and launched him into Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So again, philosophical historians tend to remark that the idea of the eternal return must have had a special impact on Nietzsche. This second comment is admittedly, this next comment I'm about to make, is admittedly one of my favorite insights about Nietzsche. Therefore, please allow me the liberty of anecdote in expressing it. Throughout the course of my education, I was taught the same platitude, namely, Nietzsche never read Kierkegaard. It turns out that's not true. I'll provide the references for anyone who wants to look deeper into the issue or to check the veracity of my claims here. So why is this important? It turns out that Nietzsche was reading excerpts from and secondary sources specifically on Kierkegaard's idea of repetition at the time when the idea of the eternal return dawned on him. We know for certain, based on what Nietzsche himself says in his letters, exactly when and exactly what Nietzsche read regarding Kierkegaard. So the sources for this, we could say the sources for the Kierkegaard-Nietzsche connection are J. Kellenberg's 1997 book, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, Faith and Eternal Acceptance, Quist's 2005 Nietzsche and Kierkegaard Tracing Common Themes, and Brobger's 2003 Nietzsche's Knowledge of Kierkegaard. The last two are articles. That first one is a book. So you could see the bibliography of Full Throttle Heart to get the full references here. So these scholars have been able to identify the exact passages from Kierkegaard and the paraphrases regarding Kierkegaard's philosophy that Nietzsche read. It's also worth noting that in February 19th of 1888, in that letter to his friend George Brandes in Copenhagen, Nietzsche wrote, "For my next trip to Germany, I have decided to study the psychological problem of Kierkegaard and to renew my acquaintance with your older literature." So notice that in this letter from 1888, Nietzsche is confirming that he was already acquainted with the literature and that he wants to renew his acquaintance. But again, if you look at the other sources that I mentioned, you'll see that this is explicit. This is not controversial anymore. Similar to the insight regarding the origin of Nietzsche's ideas about Aristophanes. Again, we're not taking anything away from Nietzsche. The insight regarding the fact of Nietzsche's exposure to the idea of repetition in Kierkegaard, what it does for us is that it opens up a space for dialogue regarding the similarities and differences between repetition and eternal recurrence. And more importantly, regarding how these thinkers credited with giving birth to existentialism understood divinity. Nietzsche was already well aware of the difference between the Greek and Jewish understandings of time. That is, it is Greek to think of time as a circle and Jewish to think of time as a line. Moreover, Nietzsche was versed in the Stoics, so the idea that we may be repeatedly dying, repeatedly subjected to birth and rebirth, should not have struck him as overly novel. What is unique about the Kierkegaardian depiction of what for shorthand's sake we may call reincarnation, Kierkegaard's idea of repetition is a Christianized version. So there are three things Nietzsche could have discerned from out of Kierkegaard's treatment of repetition. 1. Kierkegaard's notion of repetition is rooted in his discussion of despair and his articulation of the tripartite structure which he appropriated from his favorite philosopher, Kant. And I'm referring to this tripartite structure as the orders of existence. 2. For Kierkegaard, successfully traversing the orders of existence means having a relation to divinity beyond what Nietzsche and Aristotle would refer to as the herd, right? So beyond the common understanding of the divine.
Ever heard of Stoicism? Chances are, if you have, you've heard of Stoicism with a lowercase s and not Stoicism with an uppercase S. Lone wolves, no emotions, antisocial behavior, cold indifference. All that is Stoicism with a lowercase s. Stoicism with an uppercase S is the ancient Greek philosophy and virtue ethics framework that centers on service to the cosmopolis, to include your family, friends, community, and planet, and the development of a good moral character. My name is Tanner Campbell, and I'm the host of Practical Stoicism, a 3 times a week podcast teaching Stoic principles and concepts to anyone interested through the exploration of texts and deep dives into various moral topics. You can find Practical Stoicism where you're already listening to podcasts by searching for Practical Stoicism or by going to stoicismpod.com. I invite you to give it a listen today. You just might like it.
This is why so many Christians, quote unquote, Christians don't like Kierkegaard, despite the fact that Kierkegaard is universally referred to as a Christian existentialist. 3. Kierkegaard used the explicit language of death to characterize liberation from despair. So these are 3 ideas or 3 insights that Nietzsche could have discerned from Kierkegaard's idea of repetition. So let's get clear on what this means. For Kierkegaard, despair is the sickness unto death. A person in despair is continuously dying without being able to die. All of these things that I'm emphasizing here are in the service of understanding Nietzsche. So stay with me here. I'm not trying to sidetrack into Kierkegaard. We're still talking about Nietzsche. According to Kierkegaard, once an individual is able to achieve the appropriate relation to divinity, then they are able to truly die. In other words, with the proper relation to divinity, their death stops their constant dying. So, just to recall, Kierkegaard said that a person in despair is someone who is continuously dying without being able to die. And when one gets the appropriate relation to divinity, then they are able to, what Kierkegaard says, die death. They are able to have an authentic death that stops their constant dying. So, this in its logical structure, this already is the eternal return if you're able to hear it. So if we acknowledge that death is a kind of destruction, then notice just how much agreement suddenly appears between these two thinkers, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. Just as Kierkegaard uses repetition to bring one's order of existence into focus, and the order of existence may be understood as your relation to divinity, and we're trying to get that appropriate relation to divinity so that we can truly die, in Kierkegaard's language here. So just as Kierkegaard uses repetition to bring one's order of existence into focus, Nietzsche's eternal return will function in the same way. I will later refer to this as the selective principle of eternal recurrence. Next, both of them, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, see the highest order of existence in terms of a relation to divinity. Christ for Kierkegaard, Dionysus for Nietzsche. And they both see the highest order of existence as critical of the morality of the herd, or critical of herd morality. It's also critical of herd mentality. It's also critical of slave morality and slave mentality. Oddly enough, when Kierkegaard is concerned that Christianity isn't Christ-like enough, philosophically, the structure of his argument is the same as Nietzsche's application of Aristophanes' complaint of Euripides and Socrates. So lastly, both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche acknowledge the subordinate nature of the herd and acknowledge destruction of the individual's herd identity as a kind of apotheosis, as the key feature of liberation from the world. All right. We are posting videos on YouTube and X, selling books on Amazon, and you can see the Philosophemes in puzzle form on Instagram. I appreciate your questions and comments and your support of this open access educational podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Scalambrino, and I'll see you in the future.